So, what if the very solar panel that's designed to save our atmosphere is actually actively destroying a rainforest in Indonesia?
Yeah, that is arguably the defining environmental paradox of our time right now.
Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are, tearing down that sort of green halo of renewable energy. We're looking at the messy physical reality of saving the planet.
Right, because we all know we need to transition away from fossil fuels.
Mm.
And when you picture that, it usually looks pristine.
Exactly. Just silent, gleaming panels soaking up the sun, emitting absolutely zero pollution. We build the infrastructure and we stabilize the climate.
But building anything at a global scale requires physical space, and it requires physical materials.
And pulling those materials out of the earth and then, finding a place to actually put them, that always extracts a toll from local nature.
It does. We are rushing to solve a planetary atmospheric crisis. But every single tool we use interacts directly with local ecosystems. You can't just look at the carbon offset and call it a day.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack the really complex and honestly sometimes surprising ways solar energy interacts with the natural world.
And to guide this, we're pulling from a really comprehensive academic review.
Right. The full title of the study we're exploring is Known and Unknown Biodiversity Impacts of Solar PV, a review of life cycle stages and mitigation opportunities.
And just as a quick baseline for everyone listening, when we say PV, we are just talking about photovoltaic technology.
Right, so the literal process of converting light into electrical voltage.
Exactly. And the really defining feature of this study is its scope. It refuses to isolate a solar panel to just that one moment. It sits in a field generating electricity.
Instead, it tracks the absolute entirety of a panel's lifespan, right? From the exact moment an excavator scoops minerals out of the ground.
Yeah, through the high heat manufacturing process, the decades it spends mounted on a rack all the way to the day it degrades and is dismantled.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the journey we are about to take you on today flips a lot of assumptions totally upside down.
It really does.
We're going to discover why placing solar panels on everyday farm fields might be this hidden superpower for biodiversity. We'll look at how new tech is shrinking our footprint and why a migrating bird might mistake a field of glass for a pristine lake.
But to really grasp all of this, we first have to rethink how we actually measure environmental impact.
Okay, how so?
Well, for decades, the conversation has been overwhelmingly dominated by a single metric, which is greenhouse gas emissions.
Which makes sense. I mean, warming the atmosphere is an existential threat.
It is, totally. But this study relies on a framework from IPBES.
IPBS.
Yeah, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They point out that climate change is just one of several major drivers of global biodiversity loss.
So wait, if we only obsess over carbon emissions, it's kind of like judging a diet strictly by calorie counting while totally ignoring vitamins and nutrients?
Yes, that diet analogy captures the problem perfectly.
Like you might be losing weight, but you could be starving your body of what it actually needs to function.
Exactly. In the energy sector, swapping fossil fuels for solar PV is an undeniable victory for that calorie count. It slashes greenhouse gases immensely.
Right, and this study lays out the numbers on that. Like burning coal generates a massive 820 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity.
And solar PV drops that number down to roughly 48.
Wow, from 820 to 48.
Yeah, it's a systemic mandatory reduction if we want to stabilize the climate.
It's a massive drop. But the vitamins and nutrients part of the equation, like the vitality of the living ecosystems, that requires us to look at those other drivers.
Right, things like land use change, direct exploitation of wild species, pollution, and even invasive species.
And to measure that, this study uses a life cycle assessment, or LCA.
Which basically means auditing everything. The trucks transporting the materials, the land cleared to build the factory, the chemical runoff from refining the silicon.
And the ultimate disposal of the hardware at the end of its life.
Because every single one of those stages touches the natural world in a fundamentally different way.
Right. Like transporting heavy components across oceans can spread invasive alien species in the ballast water of ships.
Yeah, or the chemical processing creates specific pollution vectors. But the most immediate visceral impact, the one you and I actually see and react to, that happens during the operational stage.
When we physically place millions of these panels onto the Earth.
Exactly. which means we need to talk about land use.
Yeah, because this is where the bulk of public resistance to solar usually flares up, and it's where this study uncovers some incredibly mixed results.
It really depends on the context.
Yeah, it turns out whether a solar farm is a total disaster for local wildlife or an absolute sanctuary depends almost entirely on what was happening on that dirt before the construction crews even arrived.
The nuance here is so critical. If developers target an ecologically rich, undisturbed habitat, say a pristine desert or an ancient grassland, the impact is unequivocally negative.
Because you're effectively bulldozing a complex, self-sustaining web of life just to build an industrial power plant.
Right. And the study highlights that this kind of habitat fragmentation is particularly devastating for bats and larger terrestrial mammals.
Their hunting grounds just vanish.
Their ancestral migration routes get blocked by miles of chain-link fences. Their shelter is gone. It's bad.
But the flip side of that equation completely redefines how we should zone our infrastructure, because the study really highlights the positive effects of solar PV plants on arable land.
Yes, particularly land that has been heavily degraded by human activity.
Like if you take an exhausted, intensely farmed agricultural field and cover it in solar panels, local biodiversity can actually explode.
Which is wild to think about.
Mm.
But consider the biological profile of a heavily sprayed monoculture crop field.
Right.
Ecologically speaking, it's basically a green desert. The soil gets tilled constantly, which destroys all the fungal networks.
And chemical fertilizers and pesticides wipe out the insect populations.
Exactly. And without insects, the birds and small mammals just vanish.
So if you transition that specific plot of land into a solar installation, you are essentially placing that soil in protective custody for what, 20 to 30 years?
Pretty much. It gets a multi-decade break from all that plowing and chemical saturation.
And it isn't just about leaving the dirt alone, right? It's about actively engineering the space.
Yeah, this study notes that the standard practice used to be stripping the topsoil and dumping gravel everywhere just to prevent weeds from growing under the panels.
Which sounds awful for the environment.
It is. But now, when developers manage these sites with native seed mixtures and natural ground covers, the recovery is staggering.
Oh, wow. So you get these deep root systems of native plants breaking up the compacted soil.
And you suddenly restore the entire insect community. You bring back the native bees, the beetles, the butterflies.
And since insects are the foundation of the food web, their return acts like this biological magnet.
Everything else follows. But what's truly fascinating to me is how the physical presence of the solar panels alters the microclimate of the soil below them.
Oh, yeah. I found the mechanics of that shading effect incredible.
By casting partial shade throughout the day, the panels physically lower the soil temperature, and they drastically reduce moisture evaporation.
So the soil stays cooler and wetter, and the study says it can actually delay the bloom times of certain native flowers.
Right. Which, at first glance, altering a plant's natural life cycle sounds disruptive.
Yeah, it does sound bad initially.
But in practice, it creates an increase in floral abundance late in the summer, right when local pollinators are usually starving for food.
It's like a staggered biological buffet.
Exactly. Instead of all the flowers blooming and dying at the exact same time in the intense midsummer heat, the shaded plants hold off,
Extending the feeding season for the whole ecosystem. And if site managers just adjust their maintenance schedules, like waiting to mow the grass until late in the season after the nesting period.
Then these industrial sites double as protected breeding grounds for ground nesting birds.
Because they're fenced off from major predators like feral cats or foxes, and human foot traffic is virtually zero.
It's a huge win for biodiversity on arable land.
It really is. And realizing that plants can actually benefit from partial shade completely redefines how we zone agricultural land.
Because we don't necessarily have to choose between generating power and growing food.
Which brings up the concept of agrivoltaics, literally farming the exact same plot of land for both crops and electricity.
This is brilliant.
But wait, this introduces a huge biological variable, right? The photosynthesis.
Yeah.
If you are deliberately blocking direct sunlight with giant sheets of silicon, how are crop yields not just instantly plummeting?
I mean, it seems counterintuitive until you look at plant biology, specifically the light saturation point.
Okay, what is that?
Most plants can only process a certain amount of sunlight. Beyond that point, the intense midday sun actually stresses the plant out.
Oh.
Yeah, it goes into survival mode. It closes its pores to stop water loss, which actually pauses photosynthesis anyway.
So more sun doesn't always equal more growth.
Exactly. And the study details how certain shade-tolerant crops, Things like broccoli, berries, spinach, and leafy vegetables, they actually thrive under the protective canopy of solar panels.
Especially since in a lot of agricultural regions, climate change is making the summer sun way too intense for these crops anyway.
So the panels act as a highly engineered thermal shield.
They prevent the plants from sunburn and heat stress, and they also act as a physical barrier against extreme weather, like hail or torrential downpours.
And because that shade reduces soil evaporation so much, farms use significantly less water for irrigation.
From an economic standpoint, that integration is just a massive win. The study points out that layering energy production over food production can increase the overall economic value of a farm by 18 to 30%.
The farmer is basically harvesting the sun twice, once for calories and once for kilowatts.
But even with agrivoltaics maximizing our space, the sheer scale of the land use math still looks pretty daunting to me.
Always.
Like, if we want to power the entire globe and transition completely off fossil fuels, the sheer square footage of solar panels required is mind-boggling. Won't we eventually hit a physical limit on available land?
That is the structural bottleneck of the entire renewable transition, really. And it's why the study emphasizes that ecological management has to be paired with aggressive technological innovation.
Okay, so we can't just plant our way out of this.
No. The ultimate solution to the land use dilemma is higher PV module efficiencies.
Meaning, if you can extract significantly more electricity out of the exact same physical footprint, you immediately reduce the amount of land, steel, glass, and wiring you need.
Exactly. Which means we need to talk about this shift away from traditional silicon panels.
Yeah, the study highlights this massive industry breakthrough moving us toward perovskite silicon tandem cells.
Yes.
Break down the mechanics of that for us because, honestly, perovskite silicon tandem cells sounds like science fiction.
It does sound futuristic. But to understand the tandem cell, you have to look at sunlight not as a single beam, but as a broad spectrum of different energy levels.
Right.
Traditional silicon solar cells are hitting a hard physical limit. It's known as the Shockley-Queisser limit.
Okay.
Silicon is really only efficient at capturing a specific lower energy part of the light spectrum, primarily the red and infrared light.
So what happens to the rest of the light?
Well, the high energy blue and ultraviolet light either passes right through the cell or it just gets wasted as heat.
So we are just leaving a massive amount of the sun's actual energy on the table just because silicon isn't tuned to catch it.
Exactly the problem. So what a tandem cell does is it layers a revolutionary material called perovskite directly on top of the traditional silicon.
And perovsky is what exactly?
It's a crystal structure that can be chemically tuned to absorb that high-energy blue and visible light.
Oh, wow.
So the sunlight hits the panel. The top perovskite layer strips out the high-energy light and converts it to electricity.
And then the lower energy red light passes completely through the perovskite, where the silicon layer catches it at the bottom.
You got it. They work in tandem to squeeze electricity out of the entire solar spectrum.
That's brilliant. And the efficiency jump here is what really changes the game, right?
Absolutely.
Because the study specifically notes that these perovskite silicon tandem cells achieve efficiencies well above 30%.
Yes, well above 30%. To ground that in reality, traditional panels sitting on roofs right now might hover around, 18 to 22% efficiency.
Right. But early in 2025, researchers demonstrated record efficiencies of 34.6% for a single tandem cell.
And the projections suggest they will hit 38% in the 2030s.
Think about the compounding effects of that number. Going from 20% to nearly 40% efficiency essentially halves the amount of physical space required to generate the exact same amount of power.
It shrinks the entire life cycle footprint. You need half the land, half the transport trucks, and fundamentally half the raw materials pulled out of the earth.
Well, speaking of pulling materials out of the earth, we need to transition from our, ideal high-efficiency agrivoltaic farm to the hidden, unseen costs of this infrastructure.
Right, the upstream impacts.
Let's look at the sky above the panels and the deep mines feeding the supply chain, because this study documents a deeply ironic phenomenon known as the lake effect.
Yeah, the lake effect is a direct driver of biodiversity loss through accidental collision, and it stems entirely from optical physics.
How does that work?
So to a migrating waterbird flying thousands of feet in the air, a massive flat array of dark solar panels reflects polarized light in a way that perfectly mimics the optical signature of a calm, massive body of water.
Oh no. So a flock of exhausted birds sees what they think is a pristine lake. They descend rapidly to land and rest, and instead they slam into hundreds of acres of solid, unyielding glass.
Exactly. The injuries and mortalities are significant.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And even for the birds that survive the initial impact, many species of waterfowl are physically incapable of taking off again from dry, hard terrain.
Wait, really? They can't just fly away?
No, they actually need the surface tension and the runway of actual water to get airborne, so they end up stranded there.
Wow. It's a genuine ecological hazard. It clearly requires serious engineering solutions.
Yeah, perhaps by texturing the glass to break up the polarized reflection without losing that solar efficiency.
But the study demands we keep this in context by looking at the alternatives. Yes, the lake effect is tragic, but fossil fuel power lines and infrastructure currently kill an estimated 12 to 64 million birds annually in the U.S. alone through collisions and electrocution.
Right. Context is everything in these life cycle assessments. Scaling up solar, even with the lake effect, represents a massive net reduction in danger for global bird populations.
And that brings us to the very beginning of the cycle, which is upstream mining.
Right, because if you want to build a high-tech perovskite silicon tandem cell, you need aluminum, iron, copper, and silver.
And extracting those metals causes intense habitat destruction. The study points out a startling geographic reality here. Over 50% of global mining-related biodiversity loss happens in just 3 places.
Indonesia, Australia, and New Caledonia.
Why those 3 specific locations? What is it about their geography that puts them right in the crosshairs of the renewable transition?
It really comes down to geology intersecting with biology. Indonesia and New Caledonia hold massive, globally significant deposits of lateritic nickel.
And nickel is crucial for green infrastructure.
Exactly. But those mineral deposits sit directly beneath incredibly rich, highly endemic tropical rainforests.
So you cannot access the nickel without completely stripping the topsoil and removing the forest canopy.
You can't.
Right.
Australia faces similar pressures with massive bauxite deposits, which are used for aluminum.
So the geological wealth required for our clean energy future just happens to be buried under some of the most fragile biodiversity hotspots on Earth.
Which creates a deeply uncomfortable dynamic.
Yeah, like a city in Europe or North America gets to enjoy silent, emission-free electricity from a solar park, while a rainforest ecosystem in Indonesia pays the ultimate biological price.
It's an exported environmental cost.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the fact that there is no perfectly clean energy.
Everything has a footprint.
Everything. However, the study again anchors this reality against our current baseline.
Right. While the mining footprint for solar materials is highly concentrated and destructive, the mining-related biodiversity footprint for fossil fuel-based electricity is, on average, 10 times higher per unit of energy generated. Wait, 10 times higher.
On average, yes.
That is a staggering gap. I think people assume that a massive open-pit copper mine for solar panels must be somehow worse than drilling a gas well. Why is the fossil fuel footprint so much more damaging?
It's the difference between a capital footprint and an operational footprint.
Meaning what exactly?
Well, building a solar panel requires a massive upfront extraction of minerals. It's a harsh initial blow to the earth. But once that hardware is manufactured and installed, it sits there for 25 to 30 years, generating power entirely from free, unmined photons.
The fuel is literally falling from the sky.
Exactly. But a coal plant or a natural gas facility requires us to relentlessly, endlessly tear into the earth to extract fuel every single day, year after year, just to maintain the baseline power.
The extraction never stops.
Whatever.
So if we step back and look at the totality of this life cycle, the transition to solar isn't some magic wand that heals the planet without consequences. It's a physical, heavy industry.
Yes.
But it presents an unprecedented opportunity if we are strategic. If we rigorously protect wildlands and instead integrate panels into degraded arable lands to boost those native pollinators.
And if we rapidly scale high-efficiency tech like the perovskite silicon tandem cells to well above 30% to shrink our material needs.
Then we can fundamentally rewrite our relationship with the natural world.
But to execute that strategy, policymakers and engineers desperately need better standardized data.
Which is why the study concludes with a warning about how fragmented our current metrics are.
Right now, scientists are using wildly different methods to measure biodiversity loss.
And without standardized life cycle assessments, it is incredibly difficult to compare the true ecological cost of, say, an agrivoltaic farm in Spain against an offshore gas rig in the Gulf of Mexico.
We cannot effectively manage what we do not consistently measure. The zoning and infrastructure decisions we are making in this decade will irrevocably dictate the physical habitats of tomorrow.
A huge thank you to the researchers behind today's deep dive. For anyone who wants to explore the data and methodologies themselves, the source material is Known and Unknown Biodiversity Impacts of Solar PV, a review of life cycle stages and mitigation opportunities.
It's a vital piece of research. It forces you to look at our energy grid, not just as a power delivery system, but as a biological actor on the global stage.
And it highlights that technology and ecology do not have to exist in perpetual opposition. If properly engineered, they can actually support one another.
Absolutely.
The next time you are driving down the highway and you pass a sprawling solar farm, I want you to really look at it. Look past the glare of the glass. Ask yourself, are you just looking at a power plant? Or are you looking at a brand new, highly engineered ecosystem? And if it is an ecosystem, who decides what gets to live there?